Right, good afternoon, everyone, and very welcome to today's conversation, which we at the Swedish Embassy are very proud to host together with our partners at the NRF. We have today a fantastic moderator who will be conducting will be running the show for us. But while she is working to reconnect, we are all used to technical challenges at this point. I will just give a few introductory words from the side of the embassy. So we would like to first of all give you all a very warm welcome on the behalf of the embassy, and a special welcome, of course, to our panelists and our partners at NRF and our moderator, Nonsa. Our panelists are authors, researchers, and activists, and we look forward to taking part of your knowledge, your insights, and your views on today's important theme. Every year, the 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence campaign brings together like-minded organizations and individuals across the world to call for the prevention and elimination of gender-based violence. In 2021, the campaign is celebrating its 30th year. Gender-based violence happens everywhere and affects so many. At the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, we witnessed an increase in gender-based violence. As we sheltered at home from the threat outside, it became clear that these were not places of sanctuary for all. The embassy organized a talk on GBV during lockdown in April 2020 to bring light to this fact and to hear from actors in civil society, not least, who told the stories of the victims. When we gather to speak against gender-based violence, we roll off statistics and figures. But behind these numbers are, of course, individuals with lives and families. There are also some stories that are rarely reported on. Members of the queer community, rural women, refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants. Their experiences have not always been included and responded to and validated during these campaigns. Today, we would like to shine the light on the situation of those who are often excluded or who are often thrown into the shadows of these conversations in a reflection of the power structures of our societies. Working together, letting them take the lead, we can begin to challenge the social norms and relations of power which encourage violence in our communities. In Sweden, we have made strides in protecting and upholding the rights of members of the LGBTIA+ community and other vulnerable groups. As early as 1944, we legalized gay relationships. Gender changes have since many years been recognized in law, and the prohibition of discrimination based on sexual orientation is included in the Swedish constitution. These milestones show a commitment towards fighting against violence in all its forms. Yet we still have many lessons to learn and milestones to reach. Swedish government agencies are collaborating with their South African partners in civil society and government to fight against gender-based violence across the country, region, and the world. This is a valuable North-South alliance of the like-minded, which we are very proud to be a part of. As we move forward, we must make sure that our plans are inclusive. Do they stretch how we think about gender-based violence to include all those who are affected? A more inclusive mindset and approach is the only way we can begin to make a collective and sustained effort to end gender-based violence. I conclude by encouraging our viewers at home to engage with our panelists today by sharing your questions and your comments. And to our partners, the NRF, we look forward to future collaborations. Thank you. And with that, I think I can hand over also to our moderator, Nonsa. Over to you.
Ami, thank you very much for those words, and also thank you to the NRF and the Swedish Embassy for creating this platform in which we can have this very important discussion, because as we know, GBV affects mainly women, but there are those women that are in the periphery of society, and that is what we are focusing on now. We're then going to move over and head over to Dr. Beverly Damonze, and she is the NRF's Group Executive for Science Engagement and Corporate Relations. Dr. Damonze, over to you.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Ambassador Larsen-Jane. Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to you and good afternoon. It's been 30 years since the launch of the international campaign of 16 Days of Activism against Gender-Based Violence, or GBV, as we have come to call it, and yet the incidents still rise at an alarming rate, particularly in South Africa. Experts say much of the GBV in South Africa is culturally deep-rooted, with patriarchal attitudes entrenched by high levels of poverty and unemployment, which leave women and children particularly vulnerable. We can go on to add that GBV in LGBTQIA+ communities, for instance, has also been directed towards those who are not seen as conforming to their assigned gender roles. Furthermore, in several cultures, men's violence against women has been considered acceptable within certain settings or situations. And this social acceptability of violence makes it particularly challenging to address GBV effectively. We think of women in rural dwellings who may not have access to support and to help them with GBV incidences, or other marginalized communities are denied access to the support structures aimed at helping those immediately affected by the scourge. A few weeks ago, the Human Rights Watch published a heartbreaking article about shelters in South Africa being often unable to offer assistance to GBV victims from marginalized communities. Where do people go? Experts point out that more funding, training, and skills building is needed to counter discrimination in bias in shelter space directed towards marginalized communities. When taking this and much more into consideration, we can agree that a fairly large population live in fear in South Africa. Women, children, and members of various marginalized populations. Even when they are not in imminent danger, their lives are designed to avoid violence. And the COVID pandemic made the situation worse, as many were isolated and locked in homes with their abusers. Reports of violence skyrocketed to a point where, if you will recall, our president referred to GBV as South Africa's second pandemic. At the heart of it, GBV is a profound human rights violation, with many social and development impacts for the survivors, as well as their communities and society more broadly. Therefore, addressing GBV requires commitments from all of us, from civil society, from private and public organizations, government, and situations at large. So today we are really thankful for our eminent panelists who are gathered here, who will help us to understand this issue, particularly as it affects marginalized communities. We are also thankful to each of you who have joined us for a very engaging discussion this afternoon. So I thank you once again and invite you to join in this opportunity to engage on this particular topic, which continues to affect lives on a daily basis. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. So very, very sober words that you've reminded us of, that this scourge is actually a second pandemic that we are facing as a country, and also the fact that victims of GBV don't get the required help that they need in society. So, you know, quite sobering words, I must say. There's really more that needs to be done. So I'm going to hand over to our panelists, and we always enjoy what you have to say, but please bear in mind that you have each been allocated 15 minutes. So just ensure that you make your points as poignant as possible and as succinct as possible, so that we can have the opportunity to discuss other things as well, also to get to our Q&A. I'm going to hand over now to Professor Zethu Madebeni, who is our first panelist for the day. Over to you, Prof.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this opportunity to be able to share my thoughts with you. So what I want to share a little bit is really about one of the questions that was raised. How we can start reformulating language or terms used to speak about gender-based violence to be more inclusive and articulate perspectives of those who do not feature dominantly in them. And I'm very happy that the people who've just introduced themselves and spoken a little bit have mentioned the importance of including LGBTQ persons, particularly because within the understanding of gender-based violence, experiences of lesbians, gay, bisexual, trans, intersex, and queer persons usually disappear. And so my interest then is to try and understand or unpack why this is the case, and how we can work towards that. And I'll be very brief. So if you want to think about a more inclusive language, I would start by saying that this is a very tricky phenomenon. Tricky because when we talk about language and gender-based violence, we first have to undo our understanding of gender through language and through the colonial encounter, which not only presents the concept of gender and its limitations, but also this colonial encounter constructs violence and determines who can be violated and under what circumstances. And it's important here to remember that colonialism itself was violence. And part of its violence was to construct the violated without acknowledging this. So one of the ways we have to create inclusive ways of talking about gender-based violence is to deconstruct gender, while also trying to grapple with the fact that gender, as we have come to understand it, is in itself violence. A violence that wiped out histories of indigenous people for whom the concept of gender was not paramount. And because of this legacy of violence in gender, part of the work we have to do now is to undo gender so that it not only limits itself to a binary, thus asserting the kinds of denominations that are predicated on a hierarchical scale, a scale and form that reinvents the binary of colonizer-colonized, the dominant versus the dominated, the masculine, the feminine, the male, female, etc. We have to see this kind of violence in gender and the gender of violence as existing along a continuum and a continuity of colonialism and post-independence and post-apartheid in the South African context. So it is therefore not a surprise, given this dualism and that everything not fitting within the binary is excluded from gender. People who do not prescribe to heterosexuality and heteronormativity, people who are outside the gender binary and who reject the gender binary, transgender people, non-binary people, and queer conscious beings. This is also how we come to understand the problematic language of rape as corrective or curative, which suggests that those who are outside the binary, referring mostly to lesbian women in this case, those who are outside the binary can, through violence and brutality, be brought back to the binary, to the norm of heterosexuality, heteronormativity, and under the patriarchal rule. In short, we have to constantly unlearn the ways in which even our understanding of ourselves as gendered beings has been constructed to our own demise. And that's where I will leave it for now. And hopefully we can unpack this later in the Q&A. Thank you.
Prof, I'm actually looking forward to unpacking this and how you've actually, addressed this issue of gender, because we all know it's the most ancient form of identification. So I'm really looking forward to us unpacking this later. Up next, I'm going to now hand over to Professor Divya Bana, and she is going to give us her presentation. Prof, over to you.
Topic that is very central to the research that I do. In a few minutes, I just would like to illustrate the sort of work that has received the Department of Science and Innovation and the NRF funding for the last 6 years as a SACHI chair. And it has been a great privilege to be able to develop this focus of research in a country that has been labeled as at war in relation to gender. So let me begin. In 1999, I began a PhD that focused on boys, girls, gender and sexualities. And I made the argument that starting early might be a very critical option. To date, we have yet to make visible the voices of very young children. We have yet to implement strategies, and we have yet to focus deeply on the voices of children under the age of 10 specifically. So the punchline for my conversation with you today is that starting young might be one of the options that we have not deeply considered. But very specifically for today's discussion, I want to focus on boys, genders, and sexualities. The research that I have been doing with my team has encompassed a focus on the young life course with children between the ages of 6 and 18, trying to develop an understanding of gender from the viewpoints and perspectives of young people themselves. And in this development of an expanded notion of gender, a focus on boys, genders, and sexualities remains specifically missing, understudied, and at times absent. So the idea that gender works according to a binary is a common sense logic, which must be deconstructed, which must be revisited. And we need an expanded version of gender that neither excludes boys nor minimizes a focus on girls. And in this country, we are particularly careful about never minimizing the scourge of sexual and gender violence that burdens women and girls in particular. However, in addressing the key focus of today's theme in relation to marginalized voices, I argue that little boys, all genders and sexualities need to be in the picture as well. And to do this, I am basing the 4 themes in relation to the research that we have been carried out for the last few years in relation to boys in schooling, boys in and around schooling, boys inside communities. And the first issue is in relation to boys and sexual molestation. And the next theme refers to boys and the mud box. I'll explain further. And this is particularly in relation to transactional sexual relations. The third theme refers to boys all for a piece of clothing, specifically how schools put trans boys or transgender people through the ringer. And then the fourth area of focus will be on boys in exile, boys, refugee boys, boys who are migrants, and what that might mean in terms of the missing focus on violence. And so let me begin then with the first theme. In fact, as I was preparing for this afternoon's discussion, a newspaper clipping just appeared today about a male teacher from Quad Dukuza Primary School who is now alleged to have molested a 10-year-old boy as they were traveling in a vehicle together. It is alleged that this incident took place on the 18th of September in 2021. Now, incidents of such cases of molestation, of sexual abuse in relation to older male teachers and younger boys remains in the margins, both in terms of reporting, but also in terms of our research. In my particular study, not only does today's newspaper clipping become very poignant, but it also becomes quite striking in relation to how boys talk about older men in their communities. For instance, one of the boys in my study said, "I know this old man, he used to be our neighbor. It is well known in the community that he sleeps with boys." We need to also understand that in relation to sexual molestation, the issue around power dynamics, so eloquently put in the introduction of this session, is really vital to understand. And such power dynamics are not simply in relation to gender and generational hierarchies. They are steeped in cultural. They are also steeped in relation to broader structural inequalities. And these, as we know in South Africa, are deeply located within the history of apartheid and colonialism. So I refer to this entanglement of power that is both personal, individual, community-based, as well as broader structurally related, and then historically situated to understand the entanglement, but also to understand the complexity in dealing with the problem. The next issue that I want to deal with is this question of boys and the mud box. By the mud box, I am referring to the words that boys in my own study suggested to use in relation to anal sex and sexual relations and transactional sexual relations with men in the context of poverty, but also in relation to the need for alcohol and drugs. So this notion of transactional sexual relation often in our country looks at sugar daddy relationships, in particular girls in relationships with older men. But the argument that I want to make here in terms of visibility is to also understand the vulnerabilities in relation to boys and older men in relation not just to poverty, but also drugs and alcohol use. The next area of the discussion or the theme is, I title it, which I picked up from a newspaper article, "All for a Piece of Clothing." Now, when we consider gender and sexual diversity, and specifically the issue around transgender and stigmatization of transgendered identified communities of people, clothing becomes quite an important material in discrimination. So in relation to this gender binary, the refusal to see gender outside of the heterosexual construction of identity remains highly problematic. And this problem is very evident amongst young people. So in July of this year, the newspaper report suggested that a grade 11 Strand high school pupil in the Western Cape was forced to wear a green trousers as part of the girls' uniform of the school. Instead,
we seem to be losing you there a bit. Are you able to hear us?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now, Nomsa? Hello?
I can hear you.
Okay,
I can hear
great.
you
Thanks,
well.
Beverly. Okay, let me continue. So the point that I was on was this issue around transgender, which remains also very marginalized, both in the research and specifically the research amongst young people in this country. And this example from the newspaper in July 2021 is illustrative of the stigmatizing and highly transphobic climate that we are dealing with. And this has resonance, not just in schooling, but within larger communities and across our social institutions. And then the final area of the themes that I would like to address is this notion of boys in exile, boys who are in families and households and in communities, and that are the result of migrancy or refugee status. And I would like here to argue that such boys, without wanting to victimize them, remain highly vulnerable in relation to overall sexual abuse. And that further research, as our SACHI team will be also embarking upon, needs to address what this sort of marginalization means, what this means in terms of both marginalization in terms of genders and sexualities, marginalizations in terms of poverty, in terms of race and class, but also marginalization in terms of migrant status, refugee status, or status as in exile. So as I come to the kind of concluding aspects of this, this presentation, the last issue I would like to address is this: we can't just let boys be boys. The dominant focus is clearly on this gender binary, which is relentless in terms of its fixation or obsession on seeing gender as nothing but a heterosexual permutation, where boys will be boys and girls will be girls. Boys will be rough and tough, girls will be passive and obedient. Girls will be dictated to by cultural and dominant values that cast our judgment on what is masculinity and femininity. It is precisely because of this gender binary that boys find it hard to report, that boys and we as adults find it difficult to see anything but heterosexuality. This transphobic, homophobic environment, this binary system of meaning that is relentless in its oppositional cultures in relation to gender and race and class, must be addressed if we are to make any progress in addressing the issues that I have just described. It requires a broader vocabulary, and it is a vocabulary that, as a SACHI chair, funded by the NRF and the DSI, that we are building in this country to alert both our practices as well as policies in relation for a more gender equitable and a more peaceful South Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Prof. I think my take from both of the speakers is the focus on really gender identity, with Professor Bana saying it needs to be relooked at or expanded, while you know, the professor that spoke before, Professor Zethu Matebeni, actually says that it needs to be done away with. So I'm really looking forward to us unpacking this at a later stage. Our next panelist is Lehlohonolo Machaba, who's the first trans woman to reach the top 30 for Miss South Africa beauty pageant, and she holds a diploma in fashion design technology from the Tshwane University of Technology. Lehlohonolo, thank you so much for joining us. Over to you.
Thank you, Nomsa. Hello, everyone. So my presentation will be brief. I'll start by defining what is, in a simple format, what is gender-based violence. It refers to a harmful acts directed to an individual based on their gender. We've seen in South Africa how usually campaigns mainly focus on women, but like after all, this is gender-based violence. It's not necessarily women only. It's a violence related to a gender of a person. Why in South Africa we mainly focus on women only? We've seen how men are being discriminated against. We have men that are being abused in a relationship, a heteronormative relationship, but still they don't have a voice to be able to access help from your police stations, from whoever. We've silenced men in a way that they cannot be normal beings. They cannot say it out loud when they are being abused. So for me personally, as a trans woman, I feel like now it's a time that we bring gender equality, what we usually preach about gender equality. So men and women have to have 50-50. In this case, men also have a right to talk about gender-based violence. Growing up, I've seen how young boys have been mistreated, but yet they cannot say anything because they are boys. We've been taught that boys do not cry. We've been taught that boys must be strong at all times and females have to be the feminine one. After all, this is not only about gender, but also sexual orientation is part of it. Being a man, being born assigned man at birth doesn't necessarily mean that you are masculine enough to be able to what the society consider as a norm. So in this case, my main presentation will be about boys, men who are usually discriminated against, but yet they have no voice. They can not talk to anyone about what they are facing on a daily basis. I think I'll just keep it brief for now, then we'll discuss everything during the discussion.
Thank you so much, Lehlohonolo. I think you've also touched on a very important point. As we grow up, we told boys have to be tough and toughen up, and at the same time, they're also human. They hurt, they get abused, and what we find is that society is not a safe space for them to be able to seek help or cry out for help when the need exists. So I think what you've raised is also quite important. Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm now going to move over to Lerato Palakatsela. She is a human rights, or he is a human rights manager at Out LGBT Wellbeing, who believes the power of universal human rights and equality. He began his journey as a trainer at the Center for Sexuality, AIDS and Gender at the University of Pretoria. Lerato, over to you.
Thank you so much, Nomsa, for that nice introduction.
I like the fact that you said a unisex name, what we call a unisex name.
True, it's unisex, but you know, I always say my name and my surname are nice icebreakers in conversations and on panels, because my surname is quite hard to pronounce. My name is usually assigned to females, which brings us to this topic again. People always ask, your name is Lerato.
Exactly.
Yeah, but thank you so much, Nomsa.
Lerato Palakatila. Did I say it correctly? Did I
You
get
said it correctly. You said it perfectly. Thank you.
Thank you. Over to you.
Thanks, Nomsa. So thank you as well, Tlhogonolo, for making sure that I have a little bit of extra time. I think you did keep it brief. So as an old activist in the space, there's usually a lot of things that we want to share with people. And I'll use the time, I'll try and be as brief as possible without leaving anything behind. So, I think most of the previous speakers spoke a lot about patriarchy, about the kind of masculinity that we have in the country, but also on the continent or in the world in general, the toxic masculinity. It is the root cause of most of our problems. I'm the type of person or activist who likes to look at things from their root causes. The root cause of gender-based violence, of course, is from the past that we have. Prof. Zetu mentioned earlier that we have a past that is very violent, and we still see this quite a lot in our daily lives, with the violence that has not stopped post-apartheid, because we have that kind of past where, for us to get things, we sometimes become violent, and we maybe need to decluster that and maybe decolonize our mindsets in finding ways to communicate and to talk. And I also want to quickly now move to something that might be very sensitive, the issue of religion and faith-based organizations, how they also play a role in the lives of LGBTI people and women, how they perpetuate at times the kind of lives that LGBTI people live in terms of hate crimes, in terms of hate speech, in terms of making LGBTI people feel uncomfortable in spaces, in homes as well, particularly in rural areas and in townships where people depend a lot on the church for spiritual support, for emotional support, for their mental health. And you find young LGBTI people and young women and girls being expected to fit certain norms that men are usually not supposed to be in. Men are given a little bit of leeway in those spaces, particularly cisgender heterosexual men. So yeah, I know that the faith-based religion is a very sensitive one, but I think we do need a little bit of evolution in those spaces, in the faith-based spaces, in the cultural spaces, particularly in rural areas where a lot of young men are still taught that a woman must be put in line. And I'm talking mostly for heterosexual young men who are taught that women must be treated in a certain way for them to listen or for them to be good wives. Those kind of things need to be evolved. And when I'm always in this kind of spaces, I always ask myself, are we preaching to the converted here? Are we preaching to people who already know these things? I'm talking about me, I'm talking about most people on the panel. And the answer to that, is here or there, but I always believe that we need to find ways to go deeper in rural areas, in very remote places, in townships, and find ways to address these issues at the root, with these young men who do not have access to material that we might have in English or that we might have in a different language, but then also that's another issue on its own, because then the education, how well does he know how to read or to comprehend what we're talking about here or what we have written down? For the sake of time, I'll just move along a little bit quicker. My second thing that I'd like to talk about is the empowerment of women and LGBTIQA+ people. I think that one of the solutions, and I might be wrong or right, but one of the solutions that we should aim to do or to have is empowering women and LGBTI people, empowering them to be able to be independent, empowering them with skills. We know we live in a country where the unemployment rate keeps skyrocketing. It's really high, it's scarily high. But how do we empower women to be able to be independent in a space or in a world that is so predominantly patriarchal, that pushes the agenda of men and cisgender heterosexual men to be exact? How do we empower those women? Because by empowering women and young girls and LGBTI people, we are actually giving them the power to step away when they have an abuser, when they have somebody who is not treating them well, be it a family member, be it a partner, be it a neighbor. they had the power to move. They had the power to step away from the situation. But now, you know, in the current economy, we see that women, a lot of LGBTI people stick around in families or in spaces or with partners who abuse them because they do not have a choice. They do not have any other way to survive, you know, because, you know, the economy. So how do we empower people? How do we also make sure that they're economically independent enough to be able to raise their voices or to step out of toxic situations? And I'm also now going to talk about what we can do working with government or working together. We need to create more sensitization trainings, especially in rural areas, again, where this kind of information, you know, here, what we're discussing here, making sure that it gets to the people in those rural areas, the police station in a rural area, Limpopo. How do we make sure that they also understand that an LGBTI person can report a case and it is a hate crime, or, you know, it is a serious case as well. Leforonola mentioned something about boys being shamed or men being shamed to report. And this happens a lot with LGBTI men as well, with gay men, bisexual men, or trans men. You know, the police will look at you, and this has happened to somebody before, a client who came here to the office to report a hate crime. And he said that the police looked at him and said, why are you reporting a crime or an incident that another man abused you? You're a man, why didn't you fight for yourself? And they said, you know, you are being victimized because you're feminine. Why aren't you a tough man? Why aren't you tougher than who you are? Because this is a gay man who's effeminate, who does not conform to the gender norms of society. So how do we get to those police stations to make them more inclusive, to make them more sensitive to LGBTI people? So I think we need to also look into those kind of programs, those kind of access informations and platforms to discuss this in rural areas. So I think that maybe I can also give brief stats from our research that we conducted in 2016, where we found that South African LGBTI people have experienced hate crimes and hate speech. So 44% of the people who were surveyed said that they experienced a hate crime or hate speech. And this is almost half of LGBTI people. But of those people, 88% chose not to report, chose not to talk to the police about it, chose not to tell anyone about it because they feel that the police will victimize them further, which is called secondary victimization. They feel that they will not be helped. They feel helpless. They feel like they cannot access that service because it is not designed for them. So those are some of the issues. 10% said they did not go to the doctor or to the clinic or the nurse at a public hospital because they felt that they will be re-victimized, you know, where a trans woman or a gender non-conforming person comes in and a nurse calls another nurse to come and see that, or maybe an intersex person comes there with ambiguous genitalia and they're made laughing stock, where there are 10 nurses now in the office. So those kind of things are things that need to also be looked into when it comes to the health services of our country. But I mean, with that, then comes this point that I think I'm almost at the end of my presentation, but I think I just want to touch on two more points: that the mental health of LGBTI people and of women and of young girls in this country has really deteriorated. And how do we address that? What do we have to address that? Because we have lack of resources to address this issue as LGBTI organizations. I had a client today already who needed services, and they said that they would love to talk to somebody, but our psychologists, maybe and counselors are burdened and overwhelmed by cases. But you know, this is something that will keep happening until we go back to my point of empowering young women and girls, perhaps making them economically independent enough to also access private healthcare services, to access private mental health services. But I'm not saying that government should not be mandated or given the responsibility of giving those services. And also, I know I said two more points, but I've got two more and I'll conclude. So the other one is, you know, the spiritual element of things. I think Prof. Zetu again mentioned that, you know, we come from a past that is so rich where gender did not really matter. If I'm putting it correctly, those were not her exact words, but I think that, you know, also spiritually looking at things as Africans, also as where we come from, we learn a lot that there's duality in the world. There's, you know, there's hot and there's cold. There's you know, those kind of polar opposites, but people seemed to be uncomfortable with looking at polar opposites when it comes to heterosexuality and homosexuality. You know, if there is heterosexuality, there should be homosexuality. If there is cisgender, there should be transgender. I mean, that's something and a topic for another day, but I just felt that I needed to also bring it into the attention of people when we educate people, when we talk to faith-based organizations, that we need to also look at holistically that there are opposites in the world and that make the diversity of people beautiful. And the more we create that and the more we make people aware of the beauty of opposites and of diversity and of the gray areas, of course, in the middle, we make people more understanding and aligned with you know, being kinder to each other and creating a society where there's more understanding and acceptance of people. I know I might have gone a little bit over time, but I'd like to leave you with this quote, one of my favorite quotes by a novelist called Ernest Gaines. And he says, "Why is it that as a culture, we are more comfortable seeing two men holding guns than them holding hands?" Thank you.
Lerato, thank you very much. And I think what you've touched on is the fact that there still needs to be a lot of education, more especially in our communities and also in public servants that are really supposed to be of service to us. It's so sad that, you know, people who have different sexual identities cannot actually go out either to police station or to a clinic to seek help. And that really speaks to then secondary victimization of those people. We're now getting to a point where I'm going to ask a panelist each a question, and then from there, then I'll open up the Q&A session to everyone who wants to post their questions. So you can actually start doing that now on the platform. But for now, I'm going to go back to Professor Zethu. And just like I've given the last two a very nice introduction, let me just read a bit, tell you a bit about her. So she's from the University of Fort Hare. She is the first recipient of the South African Research Chairs Initiative in Sexualities, Genders and Queer Studies, a sociologist by training. Professor Madebeni's work focuses on African queer studies. Prof, there's something very interesting that you said, and I think that causes us to have a paradigm shift in terms of the way we look at identity. And I said, as I said, gender is you know, an ancient way in which people identify themselves. And if I'm not mistaken, you said that you feel that should be done away with. Also touch base on the fact that this was something that was introduced to us by coloniality, and I do agree with you that sometimes these form of identifications then create a hierarchy, which end up sort of like, you know, getting other people to be viewed as subhuman to others. So my question to you is, how do we then reverse the inequalities as a result of you know, gender identity? I'm going to make an example. So in South Africa, you've had a situation where there was apartheid, where there was discrimination along color lines, and you now have, for example, policies such as EE, BEE that are trying to use the same method to reverse those inequalities. So firstly, my question to you is, how do we go about then scrapping the whole gender identity thing? And then secondly, how do we go about reversing the inequalities brought by inequality within the gender identity? I don't know if my questions are clear to you, Prof.
All right, thank you, Nomsa. So perhaps I should clarify the idea is not to scrap out gender identity. The idea is to really understand the violence of gender, because this is where things tend to go wrong. So in our unpacking of gender, I think what we do need to realize is that the construct, gender as a construct, is something new. Yeah, you use the word ancient, and I would move away from that. It is something new. And because it is new and has been introduced to colonized beings, and particularly to indigenous population, it comes with the baggage. And that baggage is to eradicate ways of understanding who we can be in the world. And I think it's important to understand who we can be, because once we understand who we can be, it gives us an opportunity to imagine ourselves differently. So because gender restricts our imagination about who we are and who we can be, it therefore truncates our experiences to something that can only be, gender through equality or gender through equity. Whereas if we go back and we understand the problem of gender as a construct and do away with that, the construct of gender, to open up space for the imaginative space of how we can be and how we can imagine ourselves, then we can have a different kind of conversation. So, yeah, I mean, I'd like you to interrogate a little bit further. So push a little bit so that we can, we continue this conversation.
All right. So you'd like us to reimagine.
Yeah.
What is the starting point then? Where do we begin?
Okay. What would happen in our society, for example, if we did not have to start with gender? We started by imagining ourselves as human, and this is not anything new in African societies, because we have been human, and our humanness was taken away, and part of what we need to do is to find ways of how do we reclaim our humanness, that which was taken away from us, and therefore we became a thing that can only be seen through a colonial gaze or a binary form. So we became man, we became women, we became male, we became female, and these kinds of things kind of like limited our own existence. So what happens when we start from the premise of being human, and human as a category that has no gender? And of course, this is going to be complicated and very difficult for many people, because the notion of gender has been so ingrained in our lives, in our bodies, in our experiences, in our existence, same as colonialism. We are colonial beings and we no longer know how to exist outside of that frame. But if we start by pushing back and pushing against the kind of existence that only wants us to imagine ourselves, through the colonial gaze, then we will not go anywhere. So my invitation is for us to start finding different ways of imagining who we are. Go back to the notion of being human, and see what are the potentialities of that notion. And of course, we will also see that it actually has, I mean, in African context, it has no limitation. The ntu has no limitation. It actually has a kind of, it allows for so many cosmologies of existence. And if we really interrogate that and we allow ourselves to exist within that, I mean, Lerato was also talking about spirituality, etc. We would also understand that our lives cannot be truncated only to a physical experience, a bodily experience, which is what has happened in our society.
Prof, I really like what you've said, and you've really taken us back to where it all began, the fact that we are human outside of our differences. At the end of the day, we are human, and that's really the way that we've been brought up in the African context. The value for human life, the value of a human being, So thank you very much for that reminder. We have, sayings, umuntu ngumuntu ngabantu, not umuntu ngumuntu because of men or women, but because we are human beings. Thank you so much for that reminder, much appreciated. All right. I'm going to move over now to Professor Bana, who really touched on, the way boys are being discriminated against. And you also touched on the fact that this gender binary is also quite problematic, Prof. Can you just expand on that for us? Professor Bana, are you there?
Yes, I am. So the binary system has a kind of a global ordering to it, and then manifests itself within our local contexts. And as I said in my conversation earlier, that these manifestations have a historical basis, and they in order to understand the operation of this binary, we need to understand how it works within local contexts in order to unwind it, in order to remove it from its meanings, which are both, of course, binary, but also hierarchical, and therefore prevents us from becoming different, becoming other. So it is this binaries that seem to prevent us from seeing boys and girls differently. And I know Lerato spoke about religion, and I think that it's important to understand the kind of intersections between spiritual things, religious things, bodies and genders, and our thoughts and ideas and our cultural practices that all coalesce to produce that binary, such that that binary remains quite stubbornly focused upon the separation of boys and girls, but also the coming together based on the heterosexual assumption. And so I think that is some of the fundamental problems in relation to how we are going to go beyond and become different in terms of a more expansive way of thinking beyond this binary and what boys should do in terms of masculine norms, in terms of cultural entitlements, in terms of specific rituals and customary practices, in terms of religious discourses, which complexly entwine to make it seem that boys will be boys and girls, well, girls are passive, docile, and soft targets for abuse.
And I mean, in the past, and of course, rightfully so, the focus has been on girls, because stats do show that, women and girls are the ones that are affected by GBV. How important is your studies and your focus on boys in eradicating GBV?
So the studies that I'm currently, embroiled in does not focus solely on boys. The problem of gender is not a problem of boys or girls alone. It is a problem that we have to together unravel. And, education alone is by no means the panacea, but it is a good start in terms of what we may be able to do in unraveling that gender binary. So much of the research, and as I said earlier on, understanding gender in the ways that I do and in the ways that must allow for the inclusion of boys in no way means that we dismiss the focus on girls. It does mean that we need to go beyond girls in order to understand how to unravel the problems that we are faced with, We need to explore and examine the attitudes of boys towards women and girls, about the constructions of masculinity. We need to understand what might be the most appropriate way to engage with boys and men to promote the respect and responsibility, but also to ensure that we start young. And as I illustrated earlier, you know, my punchline is this: what might happen if we start early to address the norms through which young people in this country uninterruptedly, in many instances, understand gender as masculinity, entitlement, and power, and masculinity as heterosexual, and masculinity as violence and aggression.
Thank you so much, Prof, for that. I'm now going to move over to Lehlohonolo. Lehlohonolo, you earlier you touched on the fact that, you know, those in the LGBTQI community and men as well find it difficult to services, and, you know, when they report you know, whatever violations against them, they get laughed at, they get, you know, they're mocked, basically. So my question to you is, what has been your experience, or the experience of those that are closest to you?
Thank you, Namsa, for the question. I have a friend who was lodged due to hate crime, and which I still believe is gender-based violence. He was a gay person in June. So till now, nothing has been done. We only get the voice through social media. I think it's because of, as a part of the LGBTQ community, the moment you are in a relationship with a man, like Lerato mentioned earlier, that even when you go to the police, when you try to report your case, it's usually the case that you're a man, you can fight for yourself. So with him, he lost his life. No one can raise the issues how he lost his life. But from what I believe and what I've seen is that it was due to hate crime. So I think the way to go about this is doing campaigns. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're quite clear.
Oh. I think for us to go about this is to try and normalize that gender-based violence affects everyone. It affects everyone, like Lerato mentioned earlier, that there is a polar difference in every aspect of life. If you were to check, we have diversity within tradition, cultural, gender, sexuality. So now we need to normalize that every single person is being violated when whatever they're doing is not, it's affecting their human rights. I hope that makes sense with that statement. Whenever if something affects a person's human rights, you are violating, it's part of the gender-based violence. So when a police officer doesn't necessarily cater on a person based on what they've experienced, more especially as a man who's attracted to another man, I also believe that is part of gender-based violence, which is something that we need to talk about more often. I hope I answered your question.
You have. You also used a very important word, which is gender equality. And a lot of the times when we speak about gender equality, we speak about men being equal, given equal opportunities as men. But we are now at a stage where we are expanding our definition of gender, and, you know, there is the LGBTQI community who've been there, and now we are learning and including them in society. They've always been part of our society. We actually now recognizing that they do exist. How do we then, in your suggestion, can we then work towards gender equality, you know, including all these people from different genders, just outside of just women and men?
Gender
Where do
equality,
we begin?
sorry, what is that?
No, I was just saying, what is the starting point for that?
I think the starting point has to be about educating people that gender is just a keyword that differentiates between a man and a woman. After all, we are all humans, like Professor mentioned earlier. We are all humans. In order for gender equality to exist, we need to understand that human rights is for everyone. The equality that we're fighting for peace. We're fighting for equality for a person in general. It doesn't necessarily have to be gender related, but we want peace, we want equality for every person who exists in this world. So for the society to understand, I think we just need to educate that not necessarily everything is about gender. There are people who are genderless, who do not identify themselves, who are not part of the gender spectrum or whatever you call it. So if you were to label it as gender equality, it won't necessarily cater for them. So it just needs to be human rights after all. Let's educate people that human rights is a main solution to all of our problems due to gender-based violence.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Lerato, over to you. You touched on the discrimination that people get in rural areas. And my question to you is, how do we then start, educating people, more especially those that discriminate under the umbrella of culture? How do we start with that education? For me, I just find it so frustrating, more especially with people that are supposed to be there for the communities, your healthcare workers, your policemen that are not sensitized to this, that still victimize the victim further, the one that has been violated. So how do we start with the education process, more especially in rural areas where certain mindsets are just so entrenched? How do we become partners in that and educating the people in that area?
Yeah, thanks, Nomsa. So in that, I think there's quite a bag of alternatives and options that we can play around with. But, people need to realize first and foremost that everything needs to change. Change is the only constant in life. So culture needs to evolve. Religion needs to evolve. Our way of seeing things need to evolve. That's part of the human experience. That's part of being human. Change. Our bodies change. So our mindsets change, and the way we see things always changes. And so if culture doesn't evolve, then it becomes rotten, becomes stuck in this place where it does not, move with people and the times. It does not cater to things. For example, I'll give you a very brief example where, friends of mine wanted to get married, 2 men, and question of lobola came in, like, how do we do it? But culture found a way to do it, where families exchange gifts. This is something that has been done for centuries in Africa, but these 2 families found a way to exchange gifts and to come together as family now, bringing 2 people together who are bringing 2 families together. So we need to always know that culture needs to change, and culture can evolve if the people behind that culture or those traditions want to evolve them enough. And also, I think we always need to find and get the buy-in of our allies. There are people who are allies who are not LGBTIQ+ identifying, but they're allies. And these people are usually open to discussions with LGBT organizations. They are usually open to discussions in making sure that they can, create opportunities for us to have dialogues and to have conversations in these communities, particularly with traditional leaders, with chiefs, with kings, with queens, where, those people are the key people in those communities. So where we find and we are able to have dialogues with them, we find that we are able to actually change their views and ultimately changing how they treat everybody who stays in those areas where they stay. But I think that the constant talking, the constant sensitization trainings, the discussions are what can actually get us further, where we allow for open discussions about what are the biases or what are the things that they've heard or that they know about LGBTI people, and how can we educate, how can we give further information, how can we give more accurate information, because a lot of the information that people have and that make people discriminate is usually false. You know, it's myths about how gay people convert young people, the gay agenda, how we come in and we convert young people to be gay, how, you know, the media is making young people to, so that bias or those myths are the ones actually that make people to become violent, to become angry at things that are actually not even true. So we need to have constant conversations, but we need to use our allies and people who are open to these discussions as our, you know, way of, you know, getting to them. But also we live in times of social media, and even people in rural areas have access to social media. How do we package the information? How do we make it accessible to them, but also make it easy to comprehend and to understand, you know, simple terms? How do we keep it basic for that person to actually get the facts and to be, you know, able to empower themselves or to empower other people who might be LGBTIQ in their spaces? Thank you, Nomsa. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Lerato. For those that are joining us, just members of the public, if you have any questions to our panelists, you can start posting them through. And I mean, we've got a great diversity of panelists, and I thoroughly enjoyed their presentations. I have a question or statement in which any one of our panelists can, you know, focus on or react to. Bono Mahlamba says the solution, according to the panelists, seems to be with re-education and deconstruction, but very often the approach to change men is very attacking in itself. If you want change in how things are viewed, surely you need buy-in from all sides based on mutual respect. Prof. Zethu, my feeling is that you are the best person to answer this, but I'm opening it up to any one of our panelists as well. Prof, can we start with you? I don't know if you'd like me to repeat the question.
Yes, please, Nomsa, can you please, repeat?
Okay, so Bono Mahlamba says, the solution, according to the panelists, seems to be with re-education and deconstruction. But very often the approach to change men is very attacking in itself. If you want change in how things are viewed, surely you need buy-in from all sides based on mutual respect.
Well, sounds like a comment to me.
Is it something that you'd like to challenge? Yes, it is a comment, but I think it can be challenged, right?
Well, you see, this is going to be tricky, right? Because, you know, if you say for us to be able to engage, there must be mutual respect. But given our context and the patriarchal nature of our society, you know, respect is such a loaded term. So, you know, we know that in terms of hierarchies, young people cannot, you know, are not automatically given the respect by older people. We know because of patriarchy, you know, women are not given the respect they deserve by men. So to say that we have to start from the premise of respecting each other so that we can engage, that's a little bit tricky, because as I'm saying, respect already has certain values attached to it. This is also why when queer people get tired of explaining themselves, or when women get tired of explaining themselves to men, they show that I can go and tell you how to treat me as an equal or as a human being, but I already know and recognize the fact that you've already diminished my possibilities of being an equal to you. So already within that frame, respect cannot exist. And I'm not, but at the same time, I'm not saying that the person who's asking the question cannot, approach respect as a potential for us to start a conversation. What I'm suggesting is that respect already is problematic because it has certain values attached to it. So for me, rather than saying we should respect each other and therefore be able to learn from each other, we should see each other as full persons that have the potential to engage each other without having to feel exhausted about explaining my queerness to you because you have no capacity to understand and engage with my queerness because of your heteronormative blindedness, right? So it requires then that kind of engagement requires you as the heterosexual and the heteronormative person to actually move away from your comfort zone. So rather than you allowing me to exist, it is you who needs to shift towards me and I shift towards you so that we can have a conversation.
Absolutely, thank you. And just to our panelists, as I read out the question, if you feel strongly about answering that question, please raise your hand and I'll hand over to you. We have another question, which I just saw. Okay, there's a question from Track Claren. Says, I believe it is essential to empower people to escape GBV. How does this approach feed into preventing GBV in the first place? There is a notion of a loss of male identity, provider, head of a household as an underlying cause of GBV. Are there interventions or studies speaking to abusers specifically? I don't know who'd like to take that one. Professor Bana, perhaps yourself, would you like me to repeat that question?
No, that's fine. That's fine, Nomsa. The question clearly points to the broader structural issues which have led to men's weakness. Masculinity has been typically based on a provider status. Masculine power has been based on the provider status linked to economic privilege. In the context of deep poverty and in the context of high rates of unemployment in contemporary times, this sense of power has been emaciated such that masculine weakness is now being seen as the reason why we have high rates of gender violence, because men are unable economically to live up to the notion of provider masculinity. And this points then to not only the broader structural, social structural complexities that entwine with being a man, but it also demands attention to why is it that we insist on men's role being associated with provider status, when men are many things. In such times as we have right now in South Africa, men are unable, like women, are unable to find work. And yet the illusion and the ideal that men should work and should provide remains a stickiness to how we understand gender. And that is a big part of the problem. It points back to then redoing gender such that men's association with the economy and with provider status must be loosened if we are to have a new understanding, a different way of becoming gender.
Absolutely, Prof. Thank you so much for that insight. Just waiting for more questions to come through. Okay, all right. I'm just going to ask Lerato. Lerato, do you have an input on the previous question?
Actually, Namsa, there's a question that I think you might have missed just about that question by Tracy, which I think I would like to maybe tackle. But maybe while you look at that, I just maybe want to add on to what Prof. Bana just said. I mean, I really think it's true that we as a society need to really look at the whole notion of men being the provider. But, you know, that's where the education comes back in. And I know this is me answering it very broadly about how do we actually go about doing this. And I don't really have an answer to this. But I think, you know, where the gender roles and this gender being really challenged, I think that's where the toxic masculinity feels a bit threatened, you know, because masculinity in itself is not toxic. It can be beautiful, but the toxicness of it, of believing that things have to be rigid, of not believing in change, of not believing in things evolving, actually causes the problem. So I think, you know, I really think that it's a good start to look at reevaluating gender, reevaluating the person who provides. And I think a lot of same-sex relationships actually challenge them. That's why you find that cisgender heterosexual men sometimes are very abusive to LGBTI people because they do not understand the challenge of, for example, a masculine lesbian woman being a provider, or a feminine lesbian woman providing for a family with her masculine identifying partner, maybe, for example. And I'm also being heteronormative by putting it that way, and I'm sorry about that, but you know, it's just an example where, you know, this feminine woman is providing for a family, you know, a family of two women, or you even find two feminine women, you know, where one of them or both of them are providing for themselves, and this man who stays maybe in the same street or in the same township or rural area cannot provide for themselves. So because they've got this pressure from society, from how society shapes our minds from a young age, how society shapes the minds of young people, that a man is the one who is supposed to do this. But then, you know, if we stop doing that and say a human is a human, you can be anything you like. If you want to be a stay-at-home dad in a heterosexual relationship, that's fine, you know, where we start accepting of those, where you're not ridiculed as a male who is heterosexual, who is, you know, masculine, who wants to do the garden or cooking. I mean, it's small things like that where, you know, boys don't cry, those kind of things. How do we make sure that in our daily conversations, we make sure that we do not emphasize on those, you know, perpetuating those fixed gender roles or masculine, you know, gender roles, or to the toxic masculinity. So yeah, Noms, I think that's what I want to add. I don't know if you were able to see the previous question from Helen J. Jack.
Yes, I that was actually posted, and I like what what you've just said now. Also, I mean, on television and these shows normally trend even on social media on a Sunday, like Date My Family. You get questions asked to the guy, do you have a job? Do you work? But at the same time, you find that, you know, the female participant has not achieved any of those things. So we really, as you say, need to really relook at the gender roles, because you find that sometimes there's a lot of pressure, you know, on certain genders when they cannot provide, more especially men. So we really need to look at that. I mean, it's time for us to revolutionize and evolve, really, you know. So the comment that you were referring to Victims of GBV go back to perpetrators in the absence of shelters or safe houses. The victim-friendly facilities at police stations are also not adequately resourced to even accommodate victims with children for that one night. We have a huge problem of GBV, as we've all acknowledged, but there isn't enough help. And just even reading that comment, you know, makes me feel so helpless. What do we do?
Okay, I think maybe I'll go first, and then the other panelists can also, I'll try and keep it brief so that they can also add. I see we might be running out of time soon, but Nomsa, you know, I think that victims, you know, this is something that I spoke to earlier about the victims going back to their perpetrators or their abusers. You know, empower women. Let us have programs that are empowering of women. I was thinking before we had this conversation earlier that we need 16 days of empowerment for women and children, or for women and LGBTI people, or for vulnerable groups in general. We need to have days that just focus on empowering people who are victims of you know, of abusers, so, you know, of perpetrators. So I think it goes back to the empowerment. But, you know, the issue of shelters comes out a lot in my line of work, where you see LGBTI refugees or asylum seekers who need shelter, who are not from South Africa, who found a way to get here, who have been abused. But, you know, the issue is so deep that they're not only dealing with the issue of not having shelter, but they might also be dealing with the issue of Home Affairs not being able to give them the asylum seeker status or giving them refugee status, because they might be asked questions like, prove that you're transgender, prove that you're gay, prove, you know, those very silly things like that. But, you know, it goes back to empowering people, but also sensitizing people at the Department of Home Affairs, all the key role players, and making sure that people, especially in townships and rural areas, people who are supposed to be serving the public, know how to serve the public, irregardless of their gender, irregardless of their sexual orientation. They are able to serve them with humility. They're able to serve them with respect, with care, and making sure that they, you know, access those services again without fear, without anxiety, or without, you know, being scared to actually be themselves. So I think that it goes back to, you know, one line for me, one word actually: empowerment. Empower women, empower LGBTI people, empower all the vulnerable groups. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Lerato. I have one more question and a comment. I'd please like to ask the panelists who's going to tackle this one to just do it in a minute, if possible, and then we will wrap up. So Patience Dlomo asks, our society is stuck with the notion of GBV being violence against women and children, but not relating to violence against men and the LGBTQI individual, hence rejection or discrimination from service providers. Other than education, what can we do to prevent GBV in our societies, and how can we address this by including women and men and LGBTQI groups? Anybody like to ask and to tackle that question? Lishokgonolo?
For me, I still feel like for a person, in order to understand, for a brain, in order to function, it needs to be educated. So the only solution that I have in mind at the moment is by educating. That's the only solution that I think might bring justice to whatever we're facing in the world. Education. Besides that, probably empowering young individuals, like Lerato mentioned earlier. Empowering and education is the only way to go about to bring justice in whatever difficulties we might be facing in the world.
And just one comment, unfortunately, I don't think we'll have time to answer that, but just to also recognize that you've posted. He says, I would like our panel members to comment on how we can create more platforms that allow people to speak their minds and be engaged without having to evoke emotions, because emotionally, most people feel strongly about what they believe in. So talking about creating platforms. And Puruta, I think you also have the power to create that platform as well. So think of ways in which you can create that platform where people are, as you say, allowed to speak our minds, because those platforms are quite pivotal in our society. Thank you so much to everyone who really participated in this. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you very much, Lehlohonolo Machaba, Professor Zethu Madebeni, Professor Divya Bana, Lerato Palakatsela, and Amy as well, Amy Lawson Jane, who is the Deputy Ambassador of the Embassy of Sweden based in Pretoria. Thank you so much for joining us, and also Dr. Beverly Damons from the NRF. And obviously this platform was created for us by the Swedish Embassy and the NRF as well. Our panelists, your insight and the kind of research that you've done in these specific fields. Thank you so much for enlightening us and just challenging us to think differently with the way that we've been conditioned. And so thank you so much for challenging our thinking and for educating us. And my wish is that these kind of conversations really continue. Thank you very much to everyone. Enjoy your afternoon.
Thank you very much, Nomsa.
Thanks, Nomsa. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Nomsa. Goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you, Nomsa.